5.
I think the general public is getting sick and tired of this burgeoning benefits bill.
4.
I just feel that we need to see more fire in the belly from the leader of the opposition if she wants to hang on to her role.
3.
I think the big difference is that Rachel Reeves has crashed the economy in a way that Liz Truss didn't.
2.
If Keir Starmer's a right-wing Prime Minister, I'm Osama bin Laden, I tell you.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello?
And me, Liam Halligan. Not content with upping defence spending and posing in military uniform, Keir Starmer has further developed his persona as a right-wing Prime Minister by overseeing some hard-nosed reform of the welfare state, which Labour, of course, introduced in the aftermath of World War II. The government's Welfare Secretary Liz Kendall in particular is right. The UK simply cannot afford to sustain the recent ballooning increases in the bill for health-related benefits, particularly for mental illness. And again, ministers are right that in many cases, the best medicine for those marooned on out-of-work benefits is to get at least some kind of job. The truth-telling habit seems to be infectious because while Labour seems to be at least talking sense about welfare reform, Tory leader Kemi Badenoch has been unleashing a reality check when it comes to the UK's net zero policies. On Tuesday, in probably her most important speech since becoming leader of the opposition last November, Badenoch lacerated her party's previous record on net zero, bemoaning high taxes on the drilling of oil and gas in the North Sea, heavily criticising rules to ban new petrol and diesel cars by 2035, and ruling the holy grail of the net zero emissions by 2050 target as, quotes, simply impossible. Will she enrage the environmentally soft left of her parliamentary party, those Tory MPs who just about fended off challenges from Lib Dems at the last election? Or will Badenoch's words reassure those on the Tory right as she takes the fight to Nigel Farage's reform? Plenty to chew on, co-pilot. Oh, and by the way, apparently we're cancelling Shakespeare.
Yeah, before we get on to this desecration of the bard, can I just say that if Keir Starmer's a right-wing Prime Minister, I'm Osama bin Laden, I tell you.
His impression of a right-wing Prime
His
Minister.
impression. Did you see him in that battle dress? It was like Henry V on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt. Honestly.
He wasn't even convinced himself that he was wearing it.
Dear, oh dear.
He reminded me of Pike in Dad's Army.
Stop.
All
Come
he
on,
needed was a Burnley scarf.
he's not as threatening as Ian Lavender, is he? Come on.
Maybe Clive Dunn.
Oh, Godfrey. Permission to speak,
We're all
sir.
doomed. We're all doomed.
We're all doomed. Yes, Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust didn't exactly live up to its name, but they're a bit worried, Liam, that Shakespeare may be a bit good and have been a bit sort of supreme in the English language. So William Shakespeare's birthplace will be decolonised over fears that portraying the playwright's success as the greatest writer will benefit the ideology of white European supremacy. Who'd have thought it?
Absolutely mad. It's absolutely. I mean, this is the man that introduced Othello. You know, I mean, how fashionable was mixed race drama in Shakespeare's time? Not very. And yet there he was. You know, maybe he's a bit too woke. There you go. There's an A-level question that will never be set. Is Shakespeare too woke?
Hath not a Jew eyes. It is, of course, hilarious, but it does make you think about the calibre of the sort of Quangoites who are put into these positions of power and then turn on the excellence or nay genius that they are supposed to be the custodians of. You know, I don't think you'd have to be too Douglas Murray to see this failure of Western civilization to defend itself and indeed to give comfort to its enemies. I can highly recommend, this is a little bit sort of marginal really, but one of my favourite poems is by another playwright who had the great misfortune, like Salieri, who was born, Liam, of course, alongside Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, which was incredibly unfortunate. You'll know the football analogy. I can't think it's like being born in the era of George Best and being fantastic, but they're still George Best. And Ben Jonson is a wonderful, amazing poet and playwright. I wrote my Cambridge dissertation on him, actually.
It's a bit like Tim Henman. He'd have won multiple Wimbledons, but for Pete Sampras.
Yes, exactly. That's very good. I knew you'd have the analogy. But Ben Jonson had the magnitude of spirit to write a poem upon Mr. William Shakespeare. And he describes him as a monument, not just for now, but for all time. And of course, Jonson was brilliant enough to recognise the supremacy, not the white supremacy, the supremacy of the great genius he had the bad luck to be born in the same era as. So 3 boos for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust.
I once starred in The Alchemist by Ben Jonson. What starred? I was once in a school play, The Alchemist by Ben Jonson.
Yes.
I was Epicure Mammon. And just rounding out my literary personae, Allison, which of course I'm trying to develop. Did you know that EastEnders star hardman Danny Dyer thinks that he might be approaching his Shakespeare era, and he wants someone to give him a part in a Shakespeare play? But he says that treading the boards in a play by the bard would be, quotes, like chucking my nut under without a snorkel. What do you think? Danny Dyer is maybe Polonius.
Yes, absolutely.
Forever to use the soul of wit, says Danny Dyer, before chinning someone.
You know that Epicure Mammon basically translates as fatty economist. So it's no wonder you took the turn you did, Halligan.
No wonder you beat me in the great weight loss competition. Of course, I had just my university era rowing machine, and you had what you've dubbed the slender handrail of Fatty's little helper, aka Manjaro. Should we get on to welfare reform?
Yeah, let's get away. But do go and look up Upon Mr. William Shakespeare, because it's a great poem. Yeah, we had this week, didn't we? I mean, this was supposed to be the sort of great benefits reform week, wasn't it? And it's quite interesting because the advance publicity was all, oh, this is dreadful. They're going to be, stealing money from the hands of disabled people and so on. But I thought the Liz Kendall package, she's obviously the Work and Pensions Secretary, to me, Liam, it didn't come close to tackling the absolutely astounding, indeed deafening figures we're dealing with. Horrifying. 65 billion was spent on sickness benefits last year. That's almost 10 billion more than we spend on defence. And that figure is forecast to rise very, very fast. And over 7 million British people are receiving benefits. A rise of more than a third in 5 years. And something I think that listeners might be interested to think about, Liam, is that pandemic instruction, stay at home, support the NHS, turned out to have extremely severe and expensive consequences, because Britain is the only developed country not to return to levels of workforce participation since before COVID. We have continued in these very, very bad habits of millions and millions of people out of work. What did you think of it? It seemed to me to be just very tepid tinkering, I thought, the announcements.
Indeed. I mean, I've spent a lot of my journalistic career following this debate. I was good mates with Frank Field, of course, who very much grappled in these waters, told to think the unthinkable by Tony Blair. When he actually came up with proposals, they were crushed by Gordon Brown because they were seen to be a bit too near the bone. But, Liz Kendall's a brave person. She's very much on, what you could call the right of the Labour Party. When she stood for election as Labour leader, since then she's been known to her friends as Liz 5%, because that's the party support that she had, because she is seen to be on the right of the party. She genuinely wants to make inroads into our benefits bill. But, I mean, this doesn't even touch the sides. Even if these policies go through, they're supposed to save 5 billion quid a year by 2030, right? That's assuming Labour MPs don't block them or water them down in some way, which they may do. That's nothing. The cost of health-related benefits by 2030 is going to be in excess of £100 billion. And those projections are likely to be underestimates. We're adding 1,000 people a day to what's called PIP, which is the main benefit package for those with health-related issues. And I get the sense that a lot of the reason Labour are doing this is just for sort of rhetorical purposes in order to try and gain themselves some credibility in focus groups and among voters. Because being no doubt, even though this is really the hard edge of politics, making people go through assessments to see if they should be in receipt of disability benefit and other benefits for mental health issues. And of course, there will be many, many people who are fully entitled to those benefits. And, it's the mark of a civilized society to extend such benefits to those people. But when you've got the mental health bill now so huge and having increased so massively, and back in the day, just 1 in 5 people who were assessed for the main health and disability benefits passed and were awarded the benefits. Now it's 2 out of every 3, because a lot of people are getting sick and tired at a time when winter fuel allowance is being cut for lots of pensioners and the purse strings are being tightened for many other deserving cases. I think the general public is getting sick and tired of this burgeoning benefits bill and the amount of borrowing that is involved. Debt, of course, which we're all going to have to shoulder for years and years to come. Just think about this, Alison. If these reforms go through with all the fire and brimstone and nasty politics related to them, and we save £5 billion a year, just think that the government is borrowing between 10 and 15 billion pounds a month. That's where we are. That's the extent to which we're living beyond our means. And of course, we're going to talk more about the economy later. We've got a brilliant Planet Normal guest talking about the economy, and we'll be talking about next week's spring statement. But it strikes me that politics is getting absolutely fixated on really quite small changes, and they're presented as absolutely enormous changes when they're not. This is just tinkering at the edges of the now beached whale that is our welfare state. It's absolutely grotesque, the amount of money we're borrowing in order to fund it. And it's absolutely grotesque that we are spending so much on debt interest because of that borrowing. We're spending in excess of 100 billion on debt interest as well because of borrowing across a whole range of headings that the government is undertaking, not least this burgeoning welfare reform bill, particularly for health-related benefits. I
agree that there's an element of, let's look tough, so we'll sort of fight back against reform. But I also think, Liam, Viz, our economist guest coming up, that, let's not forget we've got Rachel Reeves's spring statement, aka panic stations budget, next week. And as you have taught me, of course, I'm very schooled now in identifying as an economist, that the government's got to start looking.
You are an economist then, if you identify as one.
Yes. If I say I am, I am. But they have to start making the case, do they not, to the OBR and other bodies to say that they are being more financially prudent while they, I think we're in recession. I think we've been in recession for some time. I think that that's coming. But before we just talk a little bit more about the disability benefits, let's remind ourselves we spend 7.1 billion a year in benefits to foreign nationals. I think a lot of British people don't want to give 7.1 billion a year to foreign nationals. I certainly don't. That should stop immediately. And we are edging over 4 billion a year now on hotels for illegal migrants. And that is set to rise incredibly rapidly. So there are 2 other areas.
So that's 11 billion in total on those figures you cited. And that's more than twice the amount that these welfare reforms that Liz Kendall is introducing, which will be painful, and we'll see some people losing their benefits who shouldn't be losing their benefits just because of the nature of state bureaucracy. Those total savings are less than half the combined bill for welfare payments on foreign nationals and hotels for asylum seekers.
Yeah, and I would say that many Planet Normal listeners, if not all Planet Normal listeners, would be thinking, what we're doing, penalising our own possibly disabled and so on. But coming back to what you said, Liam, I think that something that disastrous, another legacy of the lockdown and the pandemic was this thing called the work capability assessment stopped being conducted in person, where people were better able to see whether claimants were legit or not. And that has remained online, and claimant reviews are either infrequent or not done at all. And so there are now 700,000 more people on incapacity benefit than before the pandemic. And those numbers, I know the numbers are just deafening, aren't they? That's projected to go over 4 million in a little over 2 years. We've got to ask ourselves, what sort of country has got these numbers of people who are unwell? And in some cases, I've seen it cited that almost a quarter of British people are ill, are they?
There's a lot of overdiagnosis going on, isn't there?
Yeah.
Particularly in the aftermath of COVID, but even before. But there's other bigger cultural issues here. You know, you and I both hugely admire, don't we, our fellow columnist, Phil Johnson.
Yes.
Phil Johnston, obviously doyen Telegraph columnist of long-standing. He wrote something in the paper, and we'll put the link in the show notes to this episode, on Tuesday. And this is, I'd just introduce it into the podcast. I think it's very, very apposite and captures a lot of where society is and the kind of fiscal and economic implications of where we are culturally. We've lost the old belief, writes Philip Johnston, that to take something out, you should be willing to put something in unless you're simply unable to do so. Once, the incentive to do so was an overriding desire to avoid the disapproval that society would direct towards those deemed to have behaved fecklessly. Rights were always balanced by duties and responsibilities. Today, we are reluctant to pass judgment on others and are paying a high price for our reticence. I think there's such a lot in that. Do you think now society is becoming a bit more hard-edged? Do you think now that people are a bit more willing to speak out about people who are clearly gaming, abusing the system?
I've learned so much in the last 48 hours, Liam, none of it designed to lower your blood pressure. Like there are these people called sickfluencers. I'm not saying young people don't suffer from mental health problems, as we know they do, but there are these people posing on TikTok and YouTube, sharing tips on how to game the system. This Motability scheme, which some listeners may have heard of, is designed to make people judge, because most people, I wrote in my column this week that a sort of beloved but slightly battered 7-year-old BMW was attacked in an underground multi-storey car park by a concrete pillar. You know that happens.
Oh, those concrete pillars, they're bobbing and weaving all over the place when you drive towards them.
They won't stay still, will they? When you're trying to. Anyway, I did take off most of the wing of the car.
My stomach's just turned when you do that. Like, oh my God, that's so bad. What did him indoors say?
Well, for quite some time, I managed to approach the car from the other side.
Yes, of course you did. You parked the car in the other direction, hoping the battered wing would just go away.
Parked the car. So it looked as though it was horribly scraped in white on our black paintwork. Yeah, so the very unfortunate. So I have been looking now for a sort of second-hand BMW and discovered this week, actually, our colleague, excellent reporter, Sam Ashworth-Hayes, has been reporting on this. Basically, Liam, anyone eligible for enhanced disability payments, that's either what you refer to PIP, the personal independence payment, or the disability living allowance, if they qualify for the mobility aspect of those benefits, and that must be receiving the higher rate, they can have access to this glorious catalogue where they can browse the Motability vehicles, which include top-of-the-range BMWs, Mercs and 4x4s, so on. Basically, Lim, if you can claim that you need this Motability help, and that was last year, 51% of those claiming PIP owing to depression. They were successful. Half who claimed PIP for ADHD, 35% who claimed PIP for bedwetting, 77% suffering from obesity, 66% claimed it for agoraphobia, and 54% were successful. This is brilliant. Who claimed it for Munchausen syndrome, a psychological condition where someone feigns symptoms of illness to gain sympathy or attention, or indeed a Series 3 BMW. 1 in 5 of all new cars sold in the UK are Motability. I was told by a reader this morning that 1 in 2 cars sold in Northern Ireland are Motability. And if you're entitled to get one of these cars, and you don't have to be someone who has trouble with mobility, because lots of people getting it now have mental health conditions. And I was told again this morning by Richard Tice, Deputy Leader of Reform, who's been making a theme of this. Richard said, now listen to this, of the 800,000 odd people using the Motability scheme last year, only 10% of Motability's vehicles are adapted for disability, right? So that's what's called WAV, wheelchair access vehicles. Only 10% of the, 815,000 claimants used the scheme last year, an increase of over 170,000 in 12 months. And why not, Liam? Because I think an awful lot of British people would quite like to have a spanking brand new car. You not only you pay a deposit and then you get no VAT on it, you get your road tax paid, you get your insurance paid, you get all your repairs done, and then you're entitled after 3 years to another brand new vehicle subsidised.
This thing is propping up the British car industry. 1 in 5 cars sold. I'm amazed at that.
Should the British taxpayer be subsidising mobility assistance at this high luxury level for people with anxiety? I think that we can hear the listeners shouting, can't we? I can hear you all shouting.
Go for a walk if you've got anxiety.
But the other thing, and this is my little conspiracy theory, and I'd be very interested if anyone has used the Motability scheme. Obviously, lots of people, perfectly legitimate people, are using it, but I'm very much coming back to what you said about, are people prepared to put up with it? I think if you say to people who would have to drive a car for many years and pay for all the MOT, and so in fact we had one listener saying that could he claim a BMW because he had MOT pending anxiety, which so you get a lot of people.
Something is rotten in the state, ... Another Hamlet reference. God, we've gone highbrow this week. That is absolutely incredible. Great reporting, as you say, by Sam Ashworth-Hayes, our Telegraph columnist. And indeed, I thought you did a really good job of writing all that up. And the link to your column on the Motability scheme is in the show notes to this episode, Alison.
Just one small query for our resident senior economist. So Rachel Reeves's budget, which she'll be desperately aiming to correct next week in the spring statement, has caused businesses to cut jobs and to freeze new hiring. And this is happening at the same time as the government is demanding that more people on benefits get a job. What's the joined up thinking there, co-pilot?
There isn't any. And you're right, Alison. We've discussed it on Planet Normal in the past. Hiring in the UK has been falling at the fastest rate since lockdown over recent months. They are not just figures from industry recruiters, consultants, but also the official ONS statistics show that as well. And there doesn't seem to be any coherence when you are trying to get people back into work, particularly younger people suffering from mental health. And crikey, Liz Kendall's absolutely right to be focusing her rhetoric, at least, on young people so they don't get into that habit of being out of work from their early 20s. Because then, a few years of that, and the likelihood is that they will never go to work because they'll just feel that work isn't for them. The habit will become ingrained. But at the same time, you've got not just a 6.7% increase way above inflation in the minimum wage, you've got a 16% increase in the minimum wage for younger people, which makes it far less likely that they're going to get those starting jobs, in the hospitality industry, whatever it is, on the factory floor, the kind of entry-level jobs that are so important as you take your first steps in the world of work. So employers, it's like a triple whammy of not wanting to employ people, and in particular younger people. They've got the large increase in employer national insurance coming in. Rachel Reeves announced it last October. It's not coming in until early April. Because of the sneaky way she did it, she raised the headline rate of employer national insurance from 13.8 to 15, but then she also slyly lowered the threshold where you start paying national insurance from roughly 12.5 grand to 5 grand, which of course will disproportionately penalise and make more expensive, lower waged younger workers, right? Completely mad if you're trying to encourage employers to take on younger people. So you've got the NIC rise, you've got the minimum wage, massive rise for younger people. And then on top of that, you've got Orange's, Us Labour's employment bill coming in, which again means that workers can claim all kinds of rights to tribunals and from day one, rather than there being, what there currently is, a trial period. You have to work for a certain amount of time before you get those rights, which again makes businesses hard pressed, less reluctant to take people on. And these guys wonder, since the budget back in October, why growth has flatlined. And a lot of the tax rises from the budget, as we'll hear when we talk to our Planet Normal guest, haven't even come in yet. It's just the prospect of these tax rises that has led to a sort of storm clouds hanging over the economy, the suppression of what the great economist John Maynard Keynes so rightly called the animal spirits that make people think, you know what, I'm going to build that factory. It's a risk, but I'm going to do it. You know what, I'm going to take out that loan and I'm going to employ those extra people. I'm going to do it. You know what, I'm going to risk my capital, risk my reputation, risk a huge amount of hard work and angst to grow my business further because I think I can see light at the end of the tunnel. These are the animal spirits. They're so important in economics. Running a modern economy is largely, or importantly, a confidence trick. It's all about getting people's minds in the right place. Like the prison warder said to Paul Newman in Cool Hand Luke, you got to get your mind right, Luke. What a great movie. What a great movie. And yet Rachel Reeves has not got the public's mind right, Luke, not least because she's imposed massive tax rises, that then get introduced later. So it's like ripping off a plaster very, very, very slowly and painfully. Plus, she then spent after that budget, in the run-up to that budget and since, months and months talking about a black hole in the public finances that was there for everyone to see who dared to look. I'm quoting Paul Johnson, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. They were his precise words, there for everyone to see, for anyone who dared to look, in order to justify tax rises that they didn't dare to put in their manifesto because they knew they wouldn't get as many votes if they did. And then we've got the spring budget coming down the track. They call economists dismal scientists. I don't want to sound overly pessimistic. I've still got great faith in the British economy, our entrepreneurs. We're still attracting a lot of foreign direct investment into this country, but hiring is falling. And it seems to me that any growth the economy is now managing to eke out is despite rather than because of government policies.
I think you're being very polite here, unusually for you. I mean, how clueless are they? You've got Liz Kendall standing up to say, we mustn't have everyone on the sick because it's so bad for the country and it's so bad for them. And then you've got, as you said, you've got Angela Rayner's, employment rights bill coming in where people are allowed to take a sick leave from day one. I mean, again, it doesn't add up. I'm sorry, Liam. I think they are beyond clueless about how to run the economy. We saw Kemi Badenoch, we're recording on Wednesday, and, she was at the dispatch box at Prime Minister's Question Time. And, she was actually saying, Rachel Reeves said in October, didn't she? Oh, I won't need to come round with a hat again because, I've got it all done now with my 40 billion of tax rises. But, clearly a huge error has been made. Some of us think an absolutely catastrophic error. And I had an email this morning from a Telegraph reader saying that hiring in his industry sector is now entirely frozen. He said only replacing the absolute key personnel, not taking on anyone else at all. And I would not be at all surprised if that was an instruction across many areas. We know you've spoken eloquently before about the free fall of manufacturing. Look, we'll talk about, the Kemi Badenoch and so on. But I was disappointed today, Liam, I must say, because I just keep thinking Starmer and Reeves, it's an open goal, as it should be an open goal. Kemi was saying to Starmer, why do we need an emergency budget next week? But there's no anger. I mean, I'm angry enough for the entire country. I just think, what have you done? What have you done? You have caused this, as you say. You have talked down the country. You've talked about a £22 billion black hole, whilst the first thing you did when you got into government was bung 11 billion in overseas climate aid.
Plus a massive public sector pay rise.
Plus a huge public sector pay rise, so generous to the train drivers. None of them would work over Christmas, which is, I think,
They didn't need to.
one of my favourite facts. They literally can't get train drivers to work now because they're quids in. So anyway, we can point to all this, but I just feel that we need to see more fire in the belly from the leader of the opposition if she wants to hang on to her role. I mean, as you said at the top, Liam, she did have one of her best speeches this week, didn't she, where she came out as a net zero skeptic.
I agree. I thought she could have made more hay at Prime Minister's questions. And I think she needs to shoot from the hip more at Prime Minister's questions. She needs, with respect to her, to get her nose out of her notes. She needs to trust her instincts and her verbal dexterity and street fighting instincts, which she does have in spades. We've both seen them, haven't we? Both in public and indeed in private when we've spoken to her.
Yes.
And I think she really needs to be a bit more freeform at PMQs, because it does matter. It matters in terms of the morale of the parliamentary party. And of course, there'll be many people in the parliamentary party who are less keen on her than they were. And it matters because that's, the one moment of the week where at least some of the public focuses on politics. But it was a shame because I thought she did give a brave and very honest speech the day before on Tuesday. She is planning to do a series of policy speeches, not so much unveiling precise policies for the next general election. I think any politician would be mad to do that when in opposition, but really giving kind of indications of her thinking and trying to garner public attention that way. And I thought she said a lot of stuff that on net zero that made a lot of sense. It's the kind of arguments that we've been making here on Planet Normal for many months and years. Even the Climate Change Commission, the government's own in-house think tank, its sort of conscience, its legally empowered watchdog on the net zero targets, even they say rightly that we will need oil and gas for many, many years going forward. Even if, you hit this mythical net zero emissions target by 2050, we're still going to use oil and gas for, between a quarter and a third of our energy. So why not drill our own? Why go through this ridiculous charade of closing down the North Sea and then importing our gas in diesel ships, liquidizing it and then re-vaporizing it, which is a massively energy intensive process, from America and Qatar, when LNG, involves 5 times more carbon emissions once you've imported it and been through all the industrial processes for the same amount of energy as drilling our own gas in the North Sea. Why not get the tax revenues from drilling our own gas in the North Sea? There's plenty of it there. Why not give the jobs to our massive energy complex, which employs between 350,000 and 500,000 people, depending on your definitions? Why keep forging ahead with these targets to phase out petrol and diesel cars, new petrol and diesel cars, targets that are even more stringent than in the EU, when we are basically just sacrificing our entire car industry to Chinese-made electric vehicles, an industry that employs upwards of 1 million people, Allison, often in parts of the country where there aren't that many well-paid jobs. This is insanity. And none of that means that you don't accept that there's some man-made climate change. It just means that you have to tackle it in a smart way that doesn't just completely destroy the lives and livelihoods of lots and lots of people, often at the lower end of the income food chain, if you like. And again, this kind of fixation on targets and electricity subsidies to electricity companies so they build renewables. We've got the most expensive energy in Europe that is hollowing out our industry, that is giving our households a much rougher ride in this cost of living crisis than they would otherwise have. And fair play to Kemi Badenoch. She said a lot of stuff that will annoy the left of her party, will annoy some of the Knights of the Shires who, as I said at the top, just about fended off the Lib Dems. But that's what she has to do. She has to have her clause 4 moment. So Blair took on the left of his party in order to convince the country that he understood that they were mad. So the country thought, well, maybe Labour isn't mad if they've got these guys running the show rather than the hard left that we saw so much of during the 70s and the 80s. And similarly, Kemi Badenoch, she has rightly said that the Tory parties, they spoke right, but they governed left. That's why they lost out. That's why they lost so many votes to reform. That's why so many of the Tory faithful stayed at home, as we were pointing out on Planet Normal, months, years ahead of the election. Many of your readers in particular were those very, very people, weren't they, Allison?
Yeah.
She has to show that she is willing to lead her parliamentary party, because her parliamentary party is way to the left of the Tory faithful out there in the country, the kind of silent majority of centre and centre-right voters that are now being picked off by reform as Nigel Farage gets rid of Rupert Lowe, tries to present himself as a more moderate, not scary figure. I would say the Tory party is in serious, serious danger. And I think Kemi Badenoch needs to make more speeches like this, speeches which signal to the broader public where she is coming from, even if she doesn't rightly, in my view, detail specific policies for the next election.
I think that you're right. And I think that, but even when I hear you say having to challenge the left of her party, we're back again, Liam, aren't we, with this? I don't think there should be a left in the Conservative Party. I think the Conservative Party should be a right-wing party. And this is what she's always going to have to come up against. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, when she took over as Conservative leader, had 3 years to dry out her wets. And this is the problem that Kemi Badenoch faces. I mean, I thought that the speech was excellent. She was absolutely showing leadership. Bear in mind, she's a trained engineer, so she's able to find the sort of practical problems. And she was at her best, really talking about how catastrophic the consequences of this Ed Miliband pursuing net zero will be for actual families. And she talked about, costs include families being forced to replace perfectly functioning cars, boilers and cookers with more expensive, less reliable versions of the same thing. And by 2040, she said the Committee on Climate Change, we could talk for a long time, Liam, about that overpowerful quango, says that half of UK homes need to rip out their boilers and replace them with a heat pump. And Kemi said there's no way we can do this quickly on that time scale. 17 million houses need to be fitted with an expensive heat pump in just 15 years. How many houses have one now? She asked. And it's fewer than 300,000. And it turns out, said the leader of the opposition, that a lot more expensive electricity and people just don't like them. And then she said, last year saw the highest number of heat pumps ever installed in the UK, 50,000. So at that rate, it'll take 340 years, not 15, to get to the target.
I think you're right, Alison. I think it's really important that she points out these home truths on net zero. It seems to me much of our political and media class, when it comes to this subject, is way out of touch with political, financial, and technological reality. Now on to our Planet Normal guest. With Chancellor Rachel Reeves due to deliver her spring statement next Wednesday, we thought it was time to invite another economist onto the rocket of right thinking, someone who might give our resident economic expert, Allison Pearson, a run for her money. Julian Jessop has more than 30 years' experience as an economist gained across both the public and private sector, having worked at His Majesty's Treasury, HSBC, Standard Chartered Bank, and the consultancy Capital Economics. Now self-employed, Julian provides expert testimony to various parliamentary committees and has also advised the independent fiscal watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility. One of the few prominent UK economists who can convey complex ideas to a broad audience, Julian posts regular articles on his Plain Speaking Economics blog, which you can find online. Given that the UK economy slowed significantly in recent months, registering almost no growth in the final 3 months of last year, I started by asking Julian Jessop about Chancellor Rachel Reeves' last major financial statement back in October 2024, which signalled big increases in taxation. How damaging does he think the Chancellor's autumn budget was? Julian, great to have you back here on Planet Normal. Let me start by asking you, just how damaging, in your view, was that October budget, Labour's first budget in 14 years?
I think it was very damaging. There are a few excuses you can point to for the slowdown in the UK economy since then. So there's no doubt that global headwinds have increased. European economies have slowed sharply. We've got the additional uncertainty created by the election of President Trump and the tariff wars resulting from that. But the UK economy has slowed much more sharply than our peers. So we went from being the fastest growing economy essentially in the G7 in the first half of last year to being one of the weakest. And I think that's no doubt due to the impact of the measures announced in the budget. The increases in taxes on businesses in particular have had a chilling effect on business confidence, but also a knock-on effect on consumer confidence. Investors are worried as well. They're not convinced that the fiscal sums will add up. So there's an additional premium in borrowing costs. And this is on top of a number of other policy headwinds in the UK. So, for example, the tightening in labour market regulations as part of the so-called Employment Rights Bill, and the uncertainty in energy markets generated by the rush to decarbonise the grid by 2030. So partly the global backdrop has become more difficult, but there's no doubt a significant part of the blame should be pointed at the Labour government and the budget in particular.
And we should be clear, Julian, while the withdrawal of winter fuel allowance was pretty much immediate after the budget, most of the tax rises that Rachel Reeves announced in October are yet to take effect. There was a slowdown in the economy in the last 3 months of last year, pretty much flat growth, maybe even negative growth when the figures are revised, as they often are. The big tax rises, though, the increase in employer national insurance, for instance, plus the increase in the minimum wage, which a lot of businesses, particularly small businesses, are really worried about having to shoulder, they don't come in until early April, do they?
Well, that's right. And there's a broader point here. I think the Treasury or the Office of Budget Responsibility, whoever you blame for the forecasts, has underestimated the importance of what economists call animal spirits here, or sort of general sense of a confidence in the economy. And I think withdrawing the winter fuel allowance for better off pensioners was actually quite a big shock, even though the amounts of money may seem relatively small and there are probably some pensioners who don't need the cash. It still sent a sort of chilling signal that this government is going to be cutting welfare left, right and centre in addition to raising taxes. So even before the budget itself, people were starting to get nervous. Then, as you say, the main budget measures haven't even kicked in yet, but firms have already paused hiring, in many cases actually started to shed jobs. Investment plans have been put on hold. The only positive thing I could say there is it's possible that some of the weakness that we're seeing now is firms bringing forward the shock that might otherwise come in April. So once April is out of the way, it might be that things are looking a little bit better. And there were a few things that were done in the budget that might be positive for growth. So you quite rightly mentioned an increase in the national minimum wage, which is going to be very painful for smaller businesses, in particular in struggling sectors like retail and hospitality. But the flip side of that is that for those low-income households who are lucky enough to keep their jobs, they will actually see quite a decent increase in their real incomes. So there'll be a few positives to come in April alongside the negatives. But I do feel that the economy is on a knife edge. I'm still optimistic we'll see a bit of a recovery in the second half of the year. But there's a significant chance that we could be tipped into a recession in the meantime, particularly if there are further measures in the upcoming spring statement that tighten the screw even further.
Now, I've always known you to be, Julian, a scrupulously fair economist. I've heard you criticise Tory governments as much as you've criticised Labour governments and praise governments of all hues as well. So let me ask you, as an economist, you and I, we look at these issues quite closely. We know that Labour's inheritance 2024 was very, very different from 1997. 1997, of course, national debt was more like 45% of GDP. When Labour came in last year, it was approaching 100% of GDP, a very different situation. But was it fair for Rachel Reeves to say and to keep saying repeatedly ad nauseum that they came into a £22 billion black hole? Because it strikes me that not only were the budget measures pretty anti-growth, but the talking down of the economy by Labour from July onwards as a way of kind of introducing the idea there were going to be tax rises, which they didn't outline in their manifesto before they were elected. It was a political ruse, it seems to me. But was there any technical merit in their claims about inheriting that black hole?
Well, certainly the broader economic and fiscal inheritance was pretty poor. I think that's a fair thing for Labour to say. So, debt around 100% of national income, record high tax burden, and lots of public services that were failing in one way or another. Lots of people who should be working are not working. So undoubtedly some problems there. But as you said yourself, drawing attention to them in the way that the Shadow Chancellor did, and then the Chancellor herself when she took the role, was damaging to confidence. And effectively, the government talked down the economy for several months before the budget came along. And then the budget itself was even tougher than many people anticipated. So I think there was a mistake there. I also think that she made a mistake on the sequencing of the policy measures. So if we go back to Liz Truss, arguably the mistake that Liz Truss made was to cut taxes before cutting spending and making the structural reforms necessary to boost growth. Arguably, Rachel Reeves has made a similar mistake, but an even worse one, because she's raised taxes before cutting spending and making the structural reforms necessary to boost growth in the longer term. So that combination arguably is even more toxic than the mistakes that Liz Truss made. And that's very clearly what we're seeing in the numbers. So business confidence, consumer confidence all down. Job insecurity has increased, which is particularly worrying for a government that was talking about what Rachel Reeves calls securonomics, making
which means the public, they don't buy that car, they don't buy that fridge, they don't book that holiday. They retain their money, don't they, which slows down the economy.
Well, that's exactly right. And again, there is a potential reason for optimism here, because for most households, their finances are in reasonably good shape. Obviously, there are exceptions. So people on some of the lowest incomes, private renters, for example, people with big mortgages. There are lots of people who are going to have a difficult few years. But many households still have quite high savings. They should benefit from falling mortgage rates still over the next couple of years. Incomes for most people are rising faster than prices. So there are good reasons to expect consumer spending to recover, but not if people don't have any confidence. And the confidence has taken a severe blow over the last few months. And if people are not confident enough to spend, then obviously demand in the economy will remain weak. And a lot of that pessimism becomes self-fulfilling, because if people don't have confidence to spend and borrow and invest, then things clearly aren't going to improve.
What can we expect next Wednesday, Julian? The spring statement.
Well, it's going to be nasty. The question is how nasty. There are lots of numbers flying around for the shortfall in the public finances. There are good reasons to think that the so-called fiscal headroom has shrunk perhaps to nothing. For a start, economic growth has been weaker than the Office of Budget Responsibility was forecasting at the time of the October budget. It was predicting growth of about 2% this year. I think we'll be lucky to get 1%.
Which makes the public finances look worse, of course. Less tax revenue, more spending on benefits and so on when the economy grows slowly.
On top of that, interest rates are higher than the OBR had been anticipating.
More borrowing costs for the government, higher debt service
and
payments.
Additional spending pressures as well. So in the short term, the government is planning to fund an increase in defence spending by cutting overseas aid, but it's also suggesting that defence spending will rise even further in the next parliament, and it's only one of a number of upward pressures on spending. I think we're going to see measures to raise at least another 10 billion a year announced next week.
On top of the increase in taxation back in October of £40 billion a year on average throughout this
Exactly.
parliament.
I don't think she'll repeat the 40 billion, and she's promised that she won't. And I think we should take her at her face value for that. But I think we will get a mix of cuts in spending, partly welfare spending. I think that everybody agrees there's plenty of slack that can be cut there, but perhaps not as much as the 6 billion they had been talking about earlier. I think there will be cuts in other budgets, and that actually worries me more. If you look at areas like the Home Office and the criminal justice system, I suspect they'll face a further squeeze on their budget. And those really are things that the government has to do. Those can't be left to the market. So I'm
Massive
worried about
backlog
that.
in a lot of court cases, of course.
Exactly. That's a good example of what economists call a public good, something that can't be provided by the market. So I think cuts there would be worrying. And then finally, I'm certain there'll be some form of tax increases. Obviously, she won't touch the main tax rates, but there are plenty of ways the government can raise more money in other ways. So one possibility already being widely discussed is extending the freeze on personal income tax allowances for a couple more years, which would raise another, say, 4 billion, but also drag another million or so people into paying higher rates of tax.
So you've got like middle-ranking nurses and teachers now, not wealthy people, highly qualified professional people, hugely important to the economy, but they're paying, rich person's tax now, and they are not rich.
Well, there's a good chance that by the end of the decade, something like 10 million taxpayers will be paying higher rates of income tax. So as you say, it's no longer the so-called rich or ultra rich. Lots of people on what most people consider middling incomes will start paying the higher rates of tax.
So they're paying tax at 40% plus NICs on top of that. So basically they're paying 53% tax.
Exactly. And many of them also will see smaller pay increases than they would otherwise have done because of the knock-on effect of the increase in employer national insurance contributions. And one of the things that I think many economists would challenge Rachel Reeves about is her claim that isn't a tax on working people, whereas it clearly is because it will be passed on in lower wages and higher prices.
A huge line of expenditure for the government, as we've touched on, Julian, and you and I have discussed a lot over the years, is the debt service bill. The government's now paying upwards of £100 billion a year on servicing its own debt. And if you look at recent borrowing numbers, the government's been borrowing 10 to 15 billion pounds a month. Absolutely enormous when you think that very damaging employer national insurance contribution increase raises 25 billion pounds a year. That's not even 2 months of debt service costs. Absolutely incredible. A lot of these debt service bills that the government is paying, it's actually borrowing to pay the interest on its existing debt. If you look at the 10 to 15 billion pound of monthly borrowing we've seen in recent times, between a third and 2/5 of that every month is money raised in order to pay debt service costs on existing debt. That's insane.
Well, there are two ways the government could address that problem. One is relatively difficult, one is relatively easy. The relatively difficult thing is to restore credibility because there's certainly an additional premium in the cost of UK government borrowing as a result of the budget last year. So if you could reassure investors that the government has a credible plan, not just to get the public finances into good shape, but also to boost economic growth, then that might help get borrowing costs down. But that's difficult to do. And I'm worried that some of the signals are that the government might actually even make things worse. There are a lot of economists, for example, who are suggesting that Rachel Reeves should bend the fiscal rules, for example, to exclude defence spending in some way. But we've already seen Europe and Germany in particular do something similar over the last few weeks. And as a result, the cost of borrowing there has jumped. So
even in Germany, that's got 60% of GDP.
Exactly. So if the markets are worried about lending to Germany with a debt that's roughly half ours, then she has to be really careful to protect her credibility. But the other thing that she could do, which is relatively easy and actually commands quite high support across the political spectrum amongst economists, so actually lots of left-wing economists, for one better way of putting it, are advocating this as well, is to reduce the amount of interest that the Bank of England pays to commercial banks on the deposits that were created as part of quantitative easing, the so-called money printing. So you could reduce that interest rate. The Bank of England would then be paying less to private banks. And because the Bank of England is owned by and guaranteed by the Treasury, that would save the taxpayer money as well. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be a huge long-term saving because hopefully interest rates would be falling over the next few years. But you could definitely save 10 to 20 billion a year for a number of years, and that could make a significant difference to the public finances. There are some technical objections to this, but I'm not sure they're very compelling compared to some of the alternative ways of raising money, including lamping up taxes even further.
I fully agree. My concern about that is that Rachel Reeves won't do it because, in fairness to him, the most high-profile advocate of that, certainly in the political space, has been Richard Tice of Reform. It's a measure I've discussed with him over many months. He's done a lot of work on it. He's really, for a politician, really delved into the detail. That's why I'm talking about it publicly. I think he deserves a lot of credit. He's obviously a very financially literate. But, you know, economists like us have been talking about it for some time, and I actually support it. I think they should do that. Do you?
I absolutely do. I agree politically it's awkward to be doing something that Reform has suggested. But
as you say, there are advocates from the so-called left of economics,
yes,
aren't
the
there?
New Economics Foundation,
Yeah.
Lots of other left-wing commentators have suggested doing this. So, and if the alternative is to raise taxes or cut welfare spending in ways that would actually create more problems in the longer term than it solves, then I think this is the lesser of several evils. There are some sort of technical objections to it. So, you know, some monetary policy experts, including the bank, would say that we need to be able to pay these high rates of interest to make sure that monetary policy works properly. But I'm not really convinced by that. And it's interesting that the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve in the US are doing things differently now as well.
More houses are owned outright these days, Julian, than are owned by someone with a mortgage. So that whole transmission mechanism of raising or lowering base rates in order to impact consumers is far less important than it was even 10 years ago.
Yes, and I think you need to view monetary and fiscal policy together. And if, as a result of this change to monetary policy, fiscal policy more generally doesn't have to be as tight, I think that's a win. To me also, obviously, we mainly talk about interest rates when we're talking about monetary policy. But the other important thing that's happening is what's happening to the overall amount of money in the economy, what economists call broad money. And the monetary growth is actually pretty slow and steady at the moment. It's not really strong enough to drive a prolonged surge in inflation. So we probably will get a bump in inflation, particularly in April, when some of the additional budget measures kick in and energy prices go up again. But I think monetary policy is already too tight. And if some of the transmission mechanism through the amount of interest that the bank pays on reserves, some of that mechanism is weakened, I don't think that really matters.
As is often the case with us, we've just gone a little bit technical there, Julian. Just to backtrack for Planet Normal listeners who didn't sit their A-level in economics, an outrage, of course. We'd always recommend economics A-levels. There's a rumour, actually, that Allison's going to sit an economics A-level, believe it or not. Or there is now, because I've just started it. Monetary policy, of course, when you talk about interest rates, what the Bank of England does, it's not just about the price of money, it's about the quantity of money. And when you say the quantity of money in the economy, broad money, we're basically talking about not just cash, we're talking about bank lending, aren't we? We're talking about loans and so on. There's not so much loans being extended for various reasons. And you feel, and I think I agree with you, that inflationary dangers, while still significant, are muted somewhat by the fact that the quantity of money in the economy, not least bank loans, relatively growing very slowly, and under some definitions are even shrinking, and that should keep a lid on inflation.
That's absolutely right. If we step back a couple of years, then broad money, as I call it, was growing in a double-digit rate. I think it peaked at around about 15%. And to my mind, it's no coincidence that was followed fairly shortly afterwards by a surge in inflation. This time around, broad money is growing at a rate of around about 4%. And that's consistent with inflation of, say, 2% and growth in economic activity of about 2%, which is absolutely love to have that. I don't think we will get that. I think we'll probably get inflation of 3% and growth of 1%. But what we don't have is the sort of rapid growth in the money supply that would lead to a prolonged period of high inflation like we saw a few years ago. So I think that's a good reason for the Bank of England to remain dovish and to continue to cut interest rates, perhaps more slowly than some would like, and probably not until May. But I think we will get further cuts in interest rates, and that could be one of the factors that lifts growth again in the second half of the year.
And yet, Julian, yes, the Bank of England's been cutting base rates, but at the same time, the market interest rates set by investors have been going up. The 10-year gilt yield, what it costs the government to borrow for 10 years, is now, isn't it, consistently higher than it was at the peak of the so-called crisis which followed Liz Truss's mini budget back in the autumn of 2022. Just finally, Julian, why do you think we're not talking about that? Why do you think the media isn't going nuts with the gilt yield now consistently higher than it was at the height of what many called an existential economic crisis when Liz Truss was Prime Minister?
Well, I think plenty of people have drawn attention to that fact. I think if I wanted to defend Rachel Reeves, I would say it's not so much the level of yields that matter, but how quickly they're moving. In the wake of the mini budget, the Liz Truss quasi-quantum mini budget, yields rose very quickly in a very short period of time and the markets became disorderly. This time around, yields have risen in the UK, but they've also risen by similar amounts in the US and Germany. So it is a little bit different this time around. But the other factor, and this is in defence of Liz Truss, is that the adverse reaction in the wake of the mini budget was compounded by some technical problems in the bond market, particularly the way that pension funds had taken some very risky bets on the level of interest rates remaining low. So she was unlucky in her timing.
And the Bank of England decided that was the time to start selling gilts back to the market, i.e. flooding the market with gilts, which is going to push the price of the gilts down, which pushes up the yields.
Exactly. So in short, I take the view that Liz Truss's mini budget was more damaging for the markets than the recent episode, but that wasn't entirely her fault. Whereas Rachel Reeves' budget has clearly been more damaging for the real economy in terms of the slowdown in growth that we've seen, the increase in job insecurity, the knock-on effects on inflation and so on. So I don't think either episode means that the people involved have come out covered in glory. I think the big difference is that Rachel Reeves has crashed the economy in a way that Liz Truss didn't.
Well, there you go, Allison. Julian Jessop returning to the rocket of right thinking. I really appreciate his clarity of thought, his brevity and his insights ahead of the spring statement next Wednesday.
Yes, I think he's great, Liam, and I'm really intrigued now, having listened to Julian. I mean, like you, speaks in a, not cautious, but not going over the top. But I'm very interested now to see what Rachel Reeves is going to pull out of the hat next week, because it really sounds like crunch time.
Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
Here's Gareth, who's talking about something that many of us will have been affected by, I think, this week, which was the passing of the last of the few, those astonishing young men who fought in the Battle of Britain for all of us. And this marvellous man was John Paddy Hemingway, who has died aged 105. And Gareth says, just reading the obituary of Paddy Hemingway today, I'm finding myself mourning the entire generation whose breathtaking achievements were common to so many. As a child, I moved among them without ever recognizing how remarkable they were, since they carried themselves as having done nothing more than a basic duty. Being shot down and left floating for hours in the North Sea until picked up by a near lightship is an experience that would shake most of us to the core. Paddy was back in the cockpit 2 days later, only to be shot down again a further 6 days later, and was then back in the cockpit again the following day, once again to engage the enemy in a fight to the death. That is heroism beyond, says Gareth. I wonder if the little Italian girl who helped him evade the Germans after he was shot down for the fourth time is still alive, and whether she has lived the life she deserved. As an Irishman, it is good he got to celebrate one last St. Patrick's Day. His obituary should be read at every school assembly across the country. I couldn't agree more, Gareth. We've lost that wonderful, amazing generation. What a remarkable story. God bless you. Rest in peace, John Paddy Hemingway. And this is a really interesting email, Liam, from George. We heard last week, Labour, part of its crackdown, talking about they're going to close NHS England. And this is George, who was Planet Normal's invaluable source during the COVID lockdown. George, reporting from inside NHS England, says, in my opinion, this latest development, that's the closure of NHS England, is not before time. The whole organisation has been drowning in its own self-importance for so long. I'll either have a job at the end of the process, allegedly being dragged out over 2 years due to it needing primary legislation changes to bring about, or I'll get made redundant and get paid off quite nicely. Just as context, though, says George, you'll like this, Liam, listen to this. When the government bangs on about saving money, the last lot of voluntary redundancies in NHS England saw just over 1,000 people leave the organisation at a cost of £79 million. So just imagine what the cost will be of shedding 10,000 staff. The number of jobs being axed seems to go up daily, says George. Honestly, some of the bleating going on here is hard to stand. People just won't see how little we actually contribute to patient care. So full are they of themselves and content to keep on taking large salaries for a fraction of the work they'd have to do in the real world. If only the Tories hadn't been so gutless about doing this. But then again, says George, they'd have been accused of trying to dismantle the whole NHS had they tried.
This is from Rachel. Question for Liam. My other half says that Liam's wrong about Trump's tariffs. He says that when claiming that tariffs were a cause of the Great Depression, Liam's ignoring the fact that they were actually a positive for the US economy for a period of several decades before the Wall Street crash. He says that this is a huge stretch and Liam's being selective in his history. He sat next to me with Wikipedia open, showing me that in all the different analyses of the Wall Street crash on that site, that nowhere does any of them mention tariffs. Now, I know that OH, that's Rachel's other half, has reversed Trump derangement syndrome, the kind that means he can see no wrong in his orange hero. I, on the other hand, am ambivalent towards Trump, but tend to lean towards a hero worship of the economic godlike figure that is Halligan. I know Allison is now far superior in financial matters, but she's got other fish to fry at the mo, so we'll leave her out of this one. Is other half correct, or has his brain been trumped beyond reason? Settle this argument, please. Be aware, though, that you may have to take OH's place if I side with Halligan and he leaves me. Love you both. Keep up the good work, and thank you for your weekly bursts of sanity. Crikey, taking my life into my hands. I would say that the point is that the Wall Street crash happened in 1929, and then the Smoot-Hawley tariffs weren't introduced until 1930, 1931. So there was a big escalation in tariffs after the Wall Street crash. And the point about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, introduced by two lawmakers of that name, both of them Republicans, by the way, in separate houses of the US Congress, is that while they started out as agricultural tariffs, other tariffs kept getting added as vested interest in the economy lobbied the government for equal treatment. And that's the danger here. And also there was massive retaliation to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs by other countries, which there weren't to America's much more moderate tariffs before the 1929 Wall Street crash. So, Rachel, if that's enough for OH to leave you, I would say he's not only not a good historian, he's also lacking, if I may say so, in gallantry.
This is from Charlotte. Dear Alison and Liam, I'm a regular listener to your Planet Normal podcast, and I've been following Alison's battle with Essex police with interest. Yesterday, the Daily Telegraph published a work of fiction penned by Sir Keir Starmer. I'm not sure why he or they thought that the Telegraph readers should be the worthy recipients of this gaslighting drivel, but perhaps he does have a sense of humour.
Gaslighting drivel. It's tripe.
It's tripe. To put things into context, says Charlotte, my husband and I are livestock farmers and have had a rough few months since Starmer was voted in by a tiny proportion of the public, as I'm sure you can imagine. When families such as ours are literally on their knees and with worse to come, the last thing you want to hear is the cause of your issues, A, telling you what a great job they're doing, and B, promising to do stuff that they're never going to achieve. I gave up a few minutes of my life to read Starmer's article and could feel my temperature rising with every line. For once, nothing to do with menopausal hot flushes. Oh, Charlotte. By the time I got to the end, I'd reached a point of total meltdown and subsequently posted, very eloquently, I thought, in the comments section. Within seconds, my comment had been removed by the Telegraph. I hadn't sworn, threatened, or otherwise written anything that could be deemed to be particularly inflammatory. However, somebody obviously took offence to my words and swiftly took them down. Look, Charlotte, we get a lot of readers, don't we, Liam, wondering how the moderators operate in the Telegraph comments. Occasionally they accidentally remove perfectly non-threatening comments, and readers and listeners will know that I am always extremely active below the line, and I am always, if the people say something's been removed, I'll always go into battle for you unless you've said something that's wholly inappropriate, which of course never happens because Planet Normal listeners are such decent people.
It would never be something that you do, Alison, of course. That
No, of course not. But on that subject, I totally applaud Allison going after Essex police with everything in her armoury, says Charlotte, which quite clearly includes the support of the Daily Telegraph. Keep up the good fight. Well, thank you, Charlotte.
So last week, Alison, you rather bossily said no long essays, please, to our lovely readers. And Mal has responded thus. Keep it short and simple. Fewer words are best. Don't go on about poor growth. Leave that to Liam and the rest. But what about Ukraine, you say? Of Putin and the Trump? Of immigration and reform? Too serious for this old chump. Dare I raise the COVID fast? The millions spent so far? Our NHS and potholed roads? Big black hole, but no bright star. Good one. Should I mention Rachel or write about Sir Keir? Surely bring up Essex Police, the knock we now all fear. OK then, Planet Normal, says Mal. Drum roll. I'll just give you a plug. No big diatribe from me, but the chance to get a mug. I'll tell you what, it's a good pitch. It's a good pitch from Mal there. That's going to take some beating.
Very strong.
How about Larry Limerick? What do you think, Alison?
Yeah, here we go. It's hotting up in Poets' Corner. Larry Limerick, aka Michael Paul Wilson. Dear Planet Normal, fab episode. Good to hear Charlotte Gill exposing the collaboration of the well-heeled woke elite. A limerick follows below. There was a co-pilot called Pearson who spoke up without trepidation. The Essex police wanted her on a leash, but she fought in court for the nation. There was a journo called Gill whose need for a woke cloak was nil. She exposed the iniquity of fake charity with rare tenacity and skill. There were two men from Reform who both worked from dusk till dawn. As their egos explode, will their supporters erode or bravely fight the woke storm? Excellent, Larry /Michael. Very, very good.
So that's it from Planet Normal for another week as the knife fight in Poet Corner continues as we leave our sanctuary sweet region, our flying refuge of reasoned views. Email of the week. It's my turn this week, and it's got to be Mal.
Yay!
It's got to be Mal, if only because he called you bossy, co-pilot. Sorry about that. So, which always gets you more mug points in my book. So Mal, please write to us at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Give us your postal address and put the words mug winner in the subject heading. Many congratulations. Your Planet Normal mug will be winging its way to you.
You do realise that inciting the listeners into hatred against the co-pilot could
Well,
be
I just called one of the listeners' other half ungallant, so I'm clearly off the leash this week.
I'm hoping Rachel's marriage is intact, and
Rachel's old man's going to come around and chin me.
What we don't need is another non-crime hate incident reported against the podcast. If you enjoy Planet Normal, we jolly well hope you do. Please subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating and a review on Spotify or wherever you do listen. It's really lovely to read all those fantastic remarks. Thank you.
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal, the madness of Planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks as ever to our producers, Isabel Bouchard, Cass Ho, and Louisa Wells, who is on honeymoon.
Oh.
Happy honeymoon to Louisa, our wonderful Louisa. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.